Hi. Oh, yeah.
You've
Oh,
got your one can.
I love that.
Someone checked the Blue Cliff record out of the Alembic Library already, so
Yes.
the copy is checked out. It'll be back. Well,
Nice.
libraries. Okay, enjoy.
Thank you so much.
Announcements. Chandra's doing Feeding Your Demons tomorrow. Everyone should come.
Okay,
So-
great. So can you turn down the volume a teeny bit on this thing? It's a little loud,
Yeah.
but that's great. Mm. Hello, hello. Oh, yeah, that's much better. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay, cool.
All right, take care. Hmm. Well, you don't need a lot of Zazen instruction, so let's just sit for a while. I might say a couple of things while we're sitting, and just in case anybody else is out there. But and then I sort of have a talk I had in mind, but it's probably not going to last till the end of the session. So when we're done, we can talk about it a little bit, and then call it a night, right? Yeah. All right. Whenever the opportunity arises, stay close to the experience of your own subjectivity. Mm. The traditional analytical scheme the roots of human subjectivity are called the skandhas, and there's often that's translated as aggregates, but some translators, including Red Pine, have recognized that actually it's a much more literally deeply rooted term. It refers to things like the clusters of aerial roots that occur in mangrove forests and so on. So and the the 6 groups of roots that we're talking about here are visual perception, auditory perception, taste and smell, the body, which is it's a sort of top level bullet point that includes sub bullets that are like sense of touch, the sense of proprioception, the sense of internal sensations that arise in our joints and muscles, etc. All of that, right? And then the last one is mental activity. It's put on exactly the same status or level as all those other things. So the claim that the Abhidharmists were making in the last few centuries before the beginning of the Common Era was that those are the roots, those are the well springs and sources of our awareness and subjectivity. And interestingly, there's a growing cohort of modern computer scientists that will say essentially exactly the same thing, and not because they're Buddhists. So stay close to the arising of those perceptions and thoughts. Notice the dynamic relationship between awareness and perception and thinking. Notice how most of the time perceptions give way to each other seamlessly without a break and without distraction. But sometimes when thoughts arise, they pull in our attention and shunt it aside from the other skandhas for a while. But it's okay, because we're always invited back to attention to the other skandhas. So just watch that process. Be close to it. Be not an observer, but a conscious participant in it. And watch how that works. Well, I for the last few weeks, the koan from the Blue Cliff record that I was was the next one on the list. Is this kind of elaborate one, and I've kind of studied a little bit before, but I was trying to figure out how I could say something significant or useful about it, and also how I could deal with the fact that it's kind of long and elaborate, and has a weird turn in the middle of it, which you'll see. So I'll read the koan. It's case 18 of the Blue Cliff record, and it's about the Emperor Suzong and the national teacher Huizhong, right? So, or Huizhong. So, the emperor asked the national teacher, "So, after you die, what will you need?" And because essentially the national teacher was old and was probably going to die pretty soon. And the national teacher said, "Build a seamless monument for me." And the emperor asked, "Well, tell me, what would that monument look like?" And the national teacher was silent for a long time. And then he asked, "Do you understand?" And the emperor said, "No, I don't understand." And so the national teacher said, "Hey, I have a disciple to whom I've transmitted the Dharma. Dan Yuan," wow, interesting, "who is well versed in this matter. Please summon him and ask him about it." So after the national teacher passed on, the emperor summoned Dan Yuan and asked him what the meaning of this was. And he said, south of Shang, north of Tan, in between there's gold sufficient to a nation. Beneath the shadowless tree, the community ferry boat, within the crystal palace, there's no one who knows. So that's the story. And, it's, to get started with it, right? Like, he's asking in some ways what would be the most respectful and helpful thing that he could do after this national teacher, who was really one of the most famous teachers in China at the time, and was a personal Zen teacher to the emperor, and so on and so forth. And he says, "Build me a seamless monument." And you might think, well, okay, so there are these monuments. You can see them that are built so skillfully that you don't see any. They're stonework that's so skillful that you don't really see any cracks or joints or anything else in it. And you might think he's talking about that, and he might be actually, but there's more to it than that, right? So, and the reason you can tell is because when the teacher says, "Well, okay, so what would it look like? You want it to be a statue of you, or a lantern, some sort of Buddhist symbol or something like that?" And he just sits there like this. Like, I could sit here for 10, 15 minutes and it would probably, not enough, right? And finally he says, "Okay, you get it?" And the teacher doesn't get it. And so he sends him to his student, first of all, to as a way of underlining the lineage, right? Which is part of the kind of underlying, literally, fabric of this koan is the lineage, right? So it's like, okay, this is your teacher now. Go see him, basically. And he says this thing. He says, south of Xiang, north of Tan, right? So that means essentially anywhere. It's just like, south of the North Pole and north of the South Pole, right? And then he says, there's gold sufficient to a nation, right? Anywhere you are, it's sufficient. Then he says, beneath the shadowless tree in the community ferry boat, right? So shadowless tree, right? It either means the sun is at noon, or simultaneously you could mean that all references to time are dissolved, right? It's a kind of it's a reference to the awakening of the Buddha under a tree, right? And he says, and under that tree of awakening, there's the ferry boat, the community ferry boat, right? So what does that do? It ferries people across, right? That's in the Heart Sutra, gate gate para gate parasam gate bodhisvaha, right? So gone to the other shore, hail, awakening, right? And then finally he says, within the Crystal Palace, there's no one who knows, right? When this koan resonates with the first koan in the Blue Cliff record, right, where it's a different emperor. The Emperor Wu invites a different Zen teacher, Bodhidharma, who wasn't at that point wasn't even a Zen teacher. He was just a teacher, right? To come and have a conversation with him. And in the end, they have this brief exchange, which is lively and, kind of great. And the teacher says, "Who are you?" And Bodhidharma says, "Don't know." And then he walks out. And so later on, the teacher is talking about this with his personal Zen teacher, Jur, and he says, and Jur says, "Do you know who this guy is?" And the teacher says, "No, I don't know." Right? And Jur says, "He's Avalokiteshvara, bringing the mind of Buddha to China, basically." Right? But more to the point, he's bringing this mind of not knowing, so no one knows. And not knowing is, according to Fayan, who was a subsequent Zen master, is the most intimate, right? So what was it that fixed it so I finally had a notion of something I could talk about? Well, so about between 6 and 7 weeks ago, there was there was a practice period going on at Tassajara, and there was this woman there whose name was Caroline. Really marvelous person, sincere, dedicated, skillful, diligent, and willing, and so on. And she, and also she had her share of troubles and difficulties and so on, and embraced them wholeheartedly, right? And she decided she was going to go for a walk. And so she told a few people, she said, oh, I'm going to go out and go for a walk. And going for a walk at Tassajara usually means going for a hike. And when you go for a hike at Tassajara, it pretty quickly gets complicated, right? So if you walk down the creek, you eventually get to this place where you're essentially clinging to cliffs up above the creek in order to continue, right? And there's a place you can turn off a little before that, but it climbs up this really steep, narrow canyon, and sometimes the trail is this wide, and there's huge drop-offs, and the trail always feels a little sketchy, and et cetera. It just, there's a lovely way you can walk up the creek, and by walking in the creek and get to a lovely waterfall, and then there's a whole other domain. There's a whole other canyon you can walk up that's tremendously beautiful and rugged and so on and so forth. Okay, there are some wind caves up there and cliffs and so on, and so she kind of said she might be going up there, and she never came back, right? And after a day of her not returning, people were out searching continuously all over, calling her name, and trying to figure out where she might have gone and cover all the territory. And finally, after about a week, by that time the fire and rescue people were there, and they found her, and she was at the bottom of a waterfall, pretty far from Tassajara, but not super far. So she'd gone out for a pretty strenuous hike and somehow fallen off a waterfall. And when they sent her to the coroner, he said she had obvious injuries that essentially indicated that she'd fallen a long way and died, right? And so yesterday was her memorial, right? And the memorial was at Green Gulch, and I went, and it was a very moving ceremony and quite beautiful. But the thing that struck me was this: the memorial is essentially an ordination, really, right? So they really do go through the ordination ceremony with the head priest, the doshi, speaking on behalf of the deceased, right? And I was like, oh, ordination, okay, right? So the whole function of ordination in Buddhism, and it gets more intense and obvious the more versions of ordination you get, right, is to bring the mind of the practitioner closer and closer to, and help them be more and more aware of what is essentially a seamless, multi-millennial fabric of the beneficial activity of practice down through the millennia, right? And all the things that surround it too. So I know I've said this before, but when you're doing Dharma transmission, you not only acknowledge all the present day teachers, in particular your teacher, the person that's giving you Dharma transmission multiple times a day, but you also and in a very elaborate long ceremony that multiple times a day for well, the whole ceremony lasts for 28 days, something like that, right? So it's a long ceremony. But also, every day you go around and you also thank essentially the inanimate objects that support that's done in a way where you're sort of you're thanking a spirit who's the spirit that manages this inanimate object, but fundamentally it's acknowledging all the inanimate objects that support your life as a practitioner, and have with which you have a complex and beneficial practice relationship, like the demon that holds up the stove, the flame in the stove that all the food gets cooked on, right? And so on. And so that's the seamless monument, right? Is the seamless fabric of practice, and it digs the Chinese Buddhism in general and Zen in particular out of this dilemma, right? Which is, there was the Buddha, and the Buddha taught, and then the Buddha was, died or achieved parinirvana, depending on how you look at it, and that was it, right? And then Buddhism continued for another 2,500 years so far, right? How do you carry forward the spirit of Buddhism without having it just be a bunch of words on a page, right? And there are a number of Buddhist sects that essentially kind of are primarily focused on the words of the Buddha, and that's really good, right? But in China, they did this thing where they're like, we are the modern, back in the day, present day teachers would say at this point, it would have been late Tang Dynasty or early Song Dynasty teachers, are worth listening to and worth reading about because they're the direct inheritors of the mind of Buddha, right? And in the late Tang and early Song Dynasty, they hooked up this lineage that's part of the sort of structural and conceptual framework that constitutes Zen, right? And you pretty much every day chant the names of all those teachers in one form or another, right? And when you read the literature, the koan literature, for example, similarly, not only is the mind of Buddha being passed along, but for example, in the first koan, in the Muman koan, Muman says, "Hey, when you get here, you're looking through Jiaozhou's eyes. So the mind of Jiaozhou is passed along too, right? And it would be easy, and actually has been a matter of dispute sometimes, to say that that's kind of heretical, because one of the fundamental principles of Buddhism is that it has that nothing whatsoever has essential nature. Nothing has a self, right? And that was true in the teachings that gave rise to the Pali Canon, and it's also doubly true in the Mahayana Canon, because the Mahayana Canon has expanded that notion to include the emptiness of concepts, things, etc., categories, all that, right? So given that that's true, how does the mind of Jiaozhou or the mind of Buddha, how is it carried forward generation by generation to this day, right? And the answer is because it's not a thing, it's a process and a practice, right? And ordination for someone who's deceased is an invitation for everyone to practice with them and with their memory of them and with their with the part of their mind that has installed itself in the mind of the practitioner, right? That's all. And to stay close to that, and to honor that, all the connections in that seamless fabric that arise from that person, right? Who, whether they're living or dead, right? And so that's why the national teacher was just quiet when the emperor asked about what kind of monument he wants, because basically that's where, in the midst of the practice of silence, is where that connection shows itself. What time is it? Yeah, it's almost 8. So I too wrote a poem after the funeral, and I thought I would read it. The slip, a moment of unbalance followed by a moment of panic, then stillness. Or the terrible weight of despair pulling you irresistibly down, then weightlessness. Or running joyfully into the open arms of a sky full of gratitude. This is all we know. The cup is broken, yet everything is surprisingly full. So that's the seamless monument, basically. So, any questions or comments?
Yeah, I really like the poem.
You mean mine or theirs?
Both.
Nice. Nice. Thank you so much. Yeah. I wrote it to sort of settle this process that was going on in my mind, and the process of thinking about Caroline, and it kind of settled during the memorial. So I thought I'd write it, basically. Yeah. Thanks. What if we sit for about 10 more minutes and then call it a night? What do you think? Cool. That's great. Well, that was lovely.